Hey guys, Dirty H here, and welcome to the Kepler project. In episode 2, I'm going to use the new Airports DLC to build a pretty outrageous sci-fi sort of styled airport. And I'm also going to install a really cool looking train as some transportation in and out of the airport. So sit back and relax guys, because this is a massive episode. Let's get to it. I'm going to put the airport out on this side of the structure, so the first thing I have to do is remove these buildings that were really not doing anything in the first place anyway. And the next thing I want to do is terraform the land where I want to put the airport. Now one piece is lower than the other. The airport is going to go on the higher section here, and the lower section is going to be filled with pipes and more industrial things that the airport may require. So let's just assume that by now we've been on Kepler for maybe 150 or 200 years, and this airport may have been built so that travelling between the different cities on Kepler is made a little bit easier. So maybe the airport's not necessarily for interstellar travel, but it could be a good means of getting from city to city on Kepler. So the first part that I'll work on here is this lower section that I've terraformed, and I've run a road down here that we're not going to see when this is all finished. But I've got real industrial buildings down here and real people working down here, because I need these for the game to function properly as well. So here I plop down a few, I think they're even vanilla style buildings, but the main building that I use here is the Dole nuclear power plant. And I've turned it to procedural objects and just tried to place that around the place because it looks very sci-fi, the colour's perfect. And it's also kind of non-assuming. I can flip it around a little bit and join them together, and it just looks like one large building. And then next is just to get that terrain ready where I want to put that airport in. So it was at this exact point here where I realized I had to rebuild the entire city. I had built this map with no airplane paths, and yeah, it's kind of embarrassing to admit that, but I've had to rebuild the entire city so that I can add those in. Normally there's a mod where we can add the airplane paths into the game later on, but for whatever reason they were just not spawning for me, and I tried everything. So I've exported all the city and brought it all back as good as I can, and this took a whole day to do, which is why this episode might be laid out, but we get it done in the end and I can carry on. So coming back over to where we first began putting the buildings down, I want to put the surface networks in now and cover all the road and really start putting the final look together here. And what I'm going for is I want it to look like there's different levels to the airport. So there might be the top deck where the planes are landing, and there might be a sub deck underneath that that has some equipment and various props on it. And I just kind of thought this would make a unique edge to the airport and make it look like there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. So in terms of props for this area, I'm sticking with some pretty tried and true ones that I've used in the past. Things like the future capsule and these sci-fi type pillars. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory really, but they just look really futuristic, so they're definitely going to be used here. I also want to make sure I'm giving access to the sub deck, so there's doors that I put in at the back so it looks like there's a loading area, and I really want to get all of this done, including all of the props on this sub deck, before I put that top level on, because obviously it becomes very difficult to detail underneath if we put that on first. So I go through and put various industrial looking props in here. I also use procedural objects on the future capsule to make some pretty cool looking steel beams on the edge. Then finally I bring that top deck over and then add some lights in underneath. I'm going to try and force as many people in the city to use public transport as I can. So I'm going to have some pretty efficient direct access public transport out here for people that want to go to and from the airport. So I've set a couple of paths that merge in on each other coming directly across the airport, and these are going to merge together on the far side and then run to the pod station, which runs right around the city. I'm also going to add in that cool train that we seen earlier, but you'll just have to wait a little bit longer for that. So at the moment, this area here around the pod station is pretty messy. I'm going to hide most of this obviously, and this road here that's servicing the pod station is the number one thing that I want to hide. So I'm setting a retaining wall up that follows the edge of the road, and then I'm going to put surface networks over it so that we can't see it, but it still gives good access to that pod station. Now, in order for me to get people to use the paths rather than the road, I've done a couple of things. Number one is I've tried to purposely make the paths much more efficient than the roads. So in order for them to use the road to go to the pod station, they'd have to walk all the way from the main road, which is just a bad idea. And some of them are doing it. You can't stop everyone, but most of them are using the much more efficient paths. And the other thing that I've done is I've used the traffic manager mod to make it so people can't cross the roads in particular areas. This also deters them from walking along the road as well. So now I can whip around and start dressing this area up a little bit, and we're using that same Dole nuclear power plant here in one place. We're using some other buildings that look very sci-fi, and most of these buildings are procedural objects, solely so that I can manipulate the shape and size of them, because in order to pull off the look I'm going for, I need these buildings to fit very neatly indeed. Next, I want to start dressing up these vanilla walkways that I've got at the moment, and I'm using the same sci-fi walkway prop that I've used in the first episode, and because I can't change these to PO, I have to sort of run with them how they are, so I use Node Controller to make the vanilla pathway a bit narrower so that it meets neatly with this prop. So now I want to finally start building this airport. So initially I've zoned out an area here that I think is about the right size, or the size that I want to make the airport, but it turns out that I can only make the runways 50 units. I can't make them any smaller, so the airport does end up being a little bit bigger than I wanted it originally, but that's okay. It's got to be functionality over fashion here. It's not necessarily going to be realistic, that's for sure, but I want it to function in game. So once I've got my 50 unit length runway all built, I can copy it and flip it around. So one's going one way and one's going the other. And I also want to make sure I'm not getting them too close to those walkways that we put in earlier as well. And once I'm all happy with their placement, I can move on to the taxiways. And these are very, very simple indeed. I'm basically hooking it up so that they use one runway to land and one to take off. And that's pretty much it. Obviously, because we've got a deck style runway here, we want them taking off and landing in the same direction every time, otherwise they're going to fly directly through the main building of the airport. So basically one end of the runway is going to be the main terminal building with two plane stands connected directly to that taxiway, and then you can see that there's just one way in and one way out, and it's a very simple airport, but it works really nicely as well. We're also going to be doing some pretty cool custom buildings with procedural objects around that main terminal building a bit later. So the last thing to do here before I can carry on is just put these concrete slabs around the runways. I went onto the Steam Workshop and downloaded some really cool futuristic looking planes by a creator named Detox, and watching the first one come in and land here, it just looks so cool, and it really is the cherry on top to the look here. And seeing that first one come in has really motivated me now to get moving and get this finished. One thing I did notice is people weren't using my path, and it's because a part of it was disconnected. So the first thing I'm going to do is just touch that path up so people can use it. And then we can start making a custom looking terminal. And I'm using procedural objects on this power plant here. It's quite a cool futuristic dystopian style build. It sort of looks very brutalist, and I think that's perfect for the airport here. So I used the same building, connect it together and sort of make it look like it's all one. And I also want to get a bit creative and put some up in the air so that it looks like the plane stands are sort of partly in the building. Next, I use the future capsule and blow it up a bit larger and put that across the deck, because it sort of looks like a really cool metal grating, and it's also got like marks and stains all over it as well, so I thought it looked really good on the deck here. And then I want to start thinking about a control tower or a command center where everything is controlled from. And I want to put this in a place with a really good vantage view of everything that's going on around the airport. So I'm going to build it on top of this building here I've put down, and then I'm going to use the same building to create a roof above it. So it looks like one level of it has got glass around it with a full view of the airport. Now I'd imagine there'd be sort of 100+ people that are in this room at any given time. So I'm making it pretty big. I'm also connecting it directly off our main building we installed earlier, so that it looks like maybe the people have access up through the main building to get into this command room. So you'll also notice that I added a few props to the top, like a really high tower right on the top, and also just a couple of futuristic props tacked onto the side of the building. This is because the building looked a little wee bit bland, and I figured there'd be at least something on the building in terms of an aerial or something like that. And the props inside this room are going to be things like walkways, handrails, there'll be cables and stuff around the place, and definitely things like desks with computers and big screens. Those screens I'd imagine would have all the flight paths and times and things like that on them. And I guess some of the other things you'll see in here are just big computers, like massive supercomputers. That's what I've sort of tried to make it look like. So the last thing that you'll see me do to finish this little command room is put some blue lights around it. I'm not sure why, but the initial vision I had, it was all lit up blue, and you could notice it from quite a way away. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do here. So with the top deck of the airport all finished now, I can finish the side of it completely. So that pretty much includes just dragging over what we've already made the side out of up to this point. So those steel beams made out of the future capsule, and also the sci-fi pillars are the main things I use here. But I don't want to make this just one side all the way from corner to corner. I've made this little zigzag in the middle just to make it look a little bit more interesting. And eventually I also put a little deck down below that that's got a couple of like refueling tanks or something like that on them. I use surface networks here, or the terraforming surface networks, to flatten the terrain underneath the runways here. And I guess this is the part that really makes it look cool. It makes it look like these runways are pretty much on the roof of this entire structure. And then the last thing to finish this off is I use that same dull nuclear power plant, but I modify it with procedural objects so it fits very snug underneath the second deck. And I add that building round all three sides, and with that the airport's pretty much done, and we've got regular planes coming in now, and it just looks great. Right, so we're going to follow a similar blueprint on the other side here where it meets the public transportation. We're going to make it look like our pedestrian paths that are spanning over the industry on the lower level are coming in on that sub deck on this side. So in other words, the top deck on this side is going to be 1 story higher than the airport side. And I've done this so that I can create a cool little walkway underneath going through to the pod station. And with the top deck here, I just want to make it look like there's extra parking here for vehicles and aircraft. Maybe there's a couple of maintenance sheds here as well. And yeah, this is basically just going to be an extension of the airport. So I've scattered around a few prop planes here, futuristic looking ones, and also the concrete here is a bit damaged and chewed up and marked. And I've got some yellow decals around the place to guide the planes. And I really love the way that those paths just slip into that sub level, you know, it's really cool watching all the people walk in there and knowing that they're going through to the pod station, and the way that the airport turned out above it, I think, yeah, I'm really pleased with it. So pretty much the last thing to do to finish off the airport part of this build now is just to add all the pipes in that I mentioned earlier in the episode down in this industrial part here. I guess what I'm trying to do here is display a little bit of the underbelly of the airport. Maybe this is all the ugly stuff that's on the lower levels so that it's sort of out of view. I also want to have a few softly lit lights down in here so that at night we can just see a few tanks and pipes being lit up, which should really give off the impression that this is an industrial area down here. And while I'm busy putting in those lights, I also put a few round on those sub levels as well, because I want to show off some of the detail that we put in there earlier. And that nice soft white glow coming out from that sub level really makes you want to look down there and see what's going on in there. So to add a little bit of animation to the area, I've also used the PO modules function and added things like steam and some sparks just coming from various spots. Now what I want to do is expand the airport terminal over to meet up with some public transport. I know for a fact we're going to get a lot of people come into the city via the airport, and I think it's pretty important to have two modes of public transport here. And eventually I'm going to have a walkway that runs around the outside of these buildings and links up with that second public transport option. So in terms of that public transport option, I was pretty set on the Hyperloop from City Walk City Wall. It's fantastic, it does a great job, and it's very futuristic. But then in the workshop I seen this cool floating train that's been added recently, so I thought I'd give it a whirl. And wow, I'm blown away. It is amazing. The people walk up the escalators beautifully, they wait in the station, there's no clipping, the train comes in very smoothly indeed, and yep, I'm definitely going to run with this. So I'm going to try and raise the station about 50 feet in the air above everything else so that the train has got a clear run to and from the next station. And we'll worry about detailing all of this up a bit later on. For now, let's push on and put the track in. She was a pretty steep learning curve. I'd never used this before, and putting down invisible train tracks 50 feet in the air was a recipe for disaster. It took me a little bit to figure it out, but just using the vanilla tracks and then upgrading these to the invisible ones later was a much easier process, and that's the one that I ended up using in the end. So it's a bit of a no frills track. It's only got a couple of very gentle bends in it, which is probably appropriate. And then the station that it's going to terminate at, I'm just going to throw in really quickly. It's going to be in an area of high use so that I can come back and potentially detail it later on. So once that track is turned invisible, it's worth noting that it doesn't completely go invisible. Every, I guess, where the nodes would normally be, turns into like a floating ring. It's got a device underneath it that looks like it's sort of 3 or 4 afterburners that are keeping it floating, but it looks really cool. And on the workshop, there was 2 versions of this. There was a clean version and a version covered in graffiti, and I've gone for the graffiti one, of course, because yeah, it just looks really cool. And probably a bit more realistic for how controlled our little city is here. There's going to be some dissident, that's for sure. So the last thing to do here before I can start detailing is get this path in that runs from the airport up to that train. This is going to be the main walkway, I guess, from the airport over to that public transport. And when that's in, I can slowly start detailing it with little doors if people are walking in and through buildings, and handrails if it's on an edge. I also extend that cool metal looking deck right over here as well. And I'm sure to add just a couple of pipes here and there to maintain that industrial sort of look. Now as this path approaches the train station, it sort of turns into a little plaza, and I'd like to turn this into like a little buzzy area with shops and bars and people everywhere. So the first thing I'll do is plug a few shops into the sides of buildings here and there. Then I want to quickly move on to putting some sort of retaining wall around the train station now that I've lifted it in the air. And to do that, I've actually used procedural objects on a building and squashed it on one direction and just used that as a retaining wall. And the reason I've done that is because it looks really futuristic and sci-fi, and it beats just having, you know, sort of a block wall around there. Next, I want to try and find a way to hide this path here. Initially, I was going to put some stairs in here where it runs up, but I think they would just be too large, and an elevator or an escalator would probably make more sense. So initially I tried with this cool stair building that I found on the workshop. Apparently you can hook paths directly up to this, but I couldn't figure a way to do that, unfortunately, so I've just put a building in here over top of where these paths go up a level to try and sort of make it look like they just walk into a building with an elevator in it. And then I can add a couple of prop doors in where the path goes through the building and formalize the entrances a bit more, and it kind of looks a bit better than stairs, I think. So in keeping with tune with the rest of the city, we're going to make this highly detailed. So now it's time to add in all the little wee finer details. Things like vending machines, rubbish bins, holographic displays with information on them, lots and lots of advertising, and definitely things like cables, hanging cables, and a couple of things here and there maybe in a state of disrepair. And then the last thing I'll do is make all of these pedestrian paths invisible. Hope you guys have enjoyed the episode today. It's definitely been something different. If you have, you'd give that a thumbs up for me. That would be awesome. And to my 4,000 beautiful subscribers, thank you guys so much for your support. It means a lot. Have a great weekend, guys. Look after yourselves and be careful. And I'll see you on the next episode. See ya.